The World Cup is coming to Qatar. Everyone celebrate! Wait, where the heck is Qatar? If you haven't heard of the small Arabian Peninsula nation, you're not alone, and you could easily miss it on a map. It's the 158th country in the world by size out of 195, and it's only 4,473 square miles, smaller than major cities including Beijing and Istanbul. It has a population of just under 2.8 million people, putting it in 76th place in terms of population density and 139th overall. It's a very small place in just about every way. Every way except one. Qatar is rich. Very rich. Its economy is largely dominated by oil and energy production. In terms of nominal GDP, it's in 55th place, and per capita, it's in 5th, only behind Luxembourg, Ireland, Norway, and Switzerland. And that's given it the ability to punch well above its weight class on the global scale. While it's technically a constitutional monarchy, it's a one-party state, and its emir has final say on just about all national affairs. And that man, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, wants to be recognized as a power player in the Middle East. Part of that is getting the World Cup and establishing the country as a soccer powerhouse. But there are just a few problems with that. For one thing, Qatar doesn't really have much of a soccer history, only starting in 1948 when oil workers there organized an impromptu match. The Qatari Sports League plays regularly, with matches seeing attendance of up to 10,000, a fraction of those seen in matches in Brazil or France. However, the vast majority of residents have never attended a soccer match, and the stadiums there are fairly small by comparison to the rest of the world. And this isn't a coincidence. Some of the reasons soccer is less popular in Qatar are cultural. Qatar is a strict Muslim country, with many of their laws reflecting that. While women are allowed at soccer stadiums in Qatar, many are uncomfortable with the close quarters. And of course, no alcohol is allowed, a deal breaker at many stadiums around the world. Additionally, the country's strict prohibitions against homosexuality mean many LGBT fans from around the world might be hesitant to travel to the country even for the World Cup. But that's not the biggest challenge facing Qatar. Put simply, Qatar was not meant to host a World Cup, but a savvy campaign from an emir who wanted to be in the game means they're hosting it nonetheless. Now, everyone involved has to figure out how to make it possible, starting with the fact that the climate is the furthest thing from hospitable for even a high-intensity board game. Remember gym class in early June in school when the teacher was making you run laps as the sun was beating down? Take that and magnify it, because Qatar is one of the hottest places in the world. The World Cup regularly occurs during the Northern Hemisphere's summer, and as Qatar is near the equator, temperatures there regularly reach over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not only brutally hot, it's life-threatening, especially during physical activity. So FIFA decided something had to be done. For the first time ever, the World Cup was moved out of summer to play in November 2022 instead. Surely this means a nice cool World Cup with a brisk breeze in the air, right? Not quite, because cooler than average in Qatar still means pretty hot. As of mid-November, temperatures are hovering in the mid-80s in desert conditions, which means that athletes will still find themselves overheating, and they might be more prone to mistakes during the game. But under the current conditions, they should be able to keep hydrated and play a normal match. And all it took was moving the game to a different season. And of course, it's not just the players. World Cup stadiums are massive, and large crowds radiate heat. That means that those watching the game could be at risk for overheating as well, and there will be no cool beers to cool off. Instead, Qatar boasts of using the power of solar panels to convert solar energy into electricity that would power fans and deliver the excess energy back to the power grid. Not only would this help keep people cool, but it would make the event carbon neutral. Will this work? No one's sure, but the Winter World Cup in Qatar should alleviate most of those problems even if it interrupts the European League's regular season. Of course, there's also another major problem. Where are we putting all these people? The World Cup is one of the most attended events in the world, with previous World Cups seeing total attendance records of over 3 million people and more than 50,000 people in a game. That's a total attendance record of more than Qatar's overall population. And while countries like Brazil, Russia, and South Africa could easily accommodate a massive number of tourists, Qatar simply doesn't have that capability. Unlike other small countries on the Arabian Peninsula, like the United Arab Emirates, it usually doesn't attract a big tourist population. Most of its visitors are business travelers, but that's all about to change. So, Qatar had to build a whole new infrastructure. How new? Qatar announced that in the years up to the World Cup, they would be developing a major new public transportation network with the Doha Metro line as its centerpiece, supplemented by a light rail line. Additionally, they would more than triple the total amount of highways to accommodate the massive influx of tourists and introduce a new major bus network. This in itself would cost billions of dollars and result in Qatar being far more well set up for future tourists. Qatar's geography does provide it an advantage in one key way. Because Qatar is small, this will provide fans with easy access to all the stadiums. The World Cup will be spread out over 5 major cities, the capital of Doha, along with Al Khor, Lusail, Al Rayyan, and Al Wakraf. The driving distance from the most northern city to the most southern city will be less than an hour in good traffic. But don't count on good traffic. All these cities, which hold the vast majority of the country's population, are all clustered on the eastern coast of Qatar, and they're going to be extremely overcrowded during the World Cup. In fact, saying that they're the majority of the population might be underselling it. Qatar's population is just under 2.8 million people, and Doha's population alone is over 2 million. The country is designed for its current population, with most of the other cities being essentially starter projects that are designed to accommodate some of the population once they're fully set up. The World Cup has kick-started some of that development, with all 5 cities getting major new hotel projects so that there's some room for all these tourists. But that means the cities might be heavily unfinished, giving tourists the impression that they're living in a model town rather than an actual city, if they're not in Doha. After all, building a city from scratch requires much more than a decades-long project. All this comes with a cost. The World Cup is a massive affair, and every country that gets it has to devote a massive investment to it. Billions of dollars, in fact. FIFA offers a heavy financial commitment to the host countries, including the prize money to the tournament winners, but it only covers a fraction of the cost in most cases. How big a fraction? Well, that depends on the country's infrastructure. Countries like Brazil and South Africa usually either build new stadiums capable of holding the massive crowds or upgrade existing ones and build facilities for all the visiting athletes. That cost usually runs between $2 and $5 billion. Qatar spent a lot more. How much more? Try close to 100 times more. The estimated cost of the World Cup in 2022 in Qatar is over $200 billion, most of it put up by Qatar as an investment in the country's future. Because while most countries just have to bolster their infrastructure, Qatar largely builds it from the ground up, and that came with a massive cost that the Emir is more than willing to pay. But others are concerned about the hidden cost. This kind of massive project doesn't come without a human toll, and Qatar largely staffed it with migrant workers, several thousand of which have died due to poor working conditions in the hot desert sun. And another of Qatar's promises seems to be falling apart as well. One of Qatar's biggest points of pride about the 2022 World Cup was that they would be the first carbon-neutral World Cup in a world increasingly concerned about climate change. But the reality might be very different. The group Carbon Market Watch has observed the construction and says the actual emissions might be massively underreported by as much as a factor of 8. The fuzzy math Qatar is using calculates the impact of the stadium over its entire life, but in the case of a World Cup stadium, they're unlikely to be used extensively after the event, especially since Qatar got by with only one mid-sized stadium in Doha and will now have a total of 8. So the question is, how did the World Cup wind up happening in Qatar anyway? Depending on who you ask, it's either savvy marketing or blatant corruption. What we know is that Qatar spent more on its bid for the Cup than any other country in history and was willing to commit an unprecedented amount of money to the process. But according to some sources, primarily from Australia, which lost the vote for the Cup, Qatar offered FIFA several $100 million to approve their bid. This was back in 2010, but it became part of a much larger investigation in 2015 when a massive FIFA scandal broke and several top officials were arrested or removed from office. While nothing has ever been proven and the Qatar World Cup went ahead, many people insist that corruption was involved. But as the World Cup in Qatar kicks off, what's it likely to look like? Qatar's done its best to overcome its geography, especially for a country that's primarily contained within one giant metro area in the desert. But it's too early to say how effective this will be. There are 2 main scenarios that could play out, and neither of them is ideal. The first has Qatar seeing a much lower attendance number than previous World Cups due to the people not feeling comfortable with attending. This could be due to doubts over the infrastructure, concerns over the country's human rights records, or fans from certain backgrounds not feeling comfortable staying there. In this case, Qatar could find itself with massive shortfalls in revenue and be left with expensive infrastructure it has little use for. But it also could find itself losing by winning. Let's say it's a smashing success. Nothing can keep soccer fans at bay, and they flood the small emirate for the biggest sports event of the year. Soon, Doha is overcrowded, with its hotels, stadiums, and public transportation system quickly overwhelmed. Qatar puts on the World Cup, but its unique geography means it might not be able to accommodate a crowd of this size. No matter how many expansions it builds in the Doha metro area, are Doha's new sister cities ready for the influx of tourists? Is the bustling Doha metropolis ready to see its population expand massively for a few weeks? There's only one way to find out. Will Qatar's massive gambit pay off, or are the challenges of its geography just too much to overcome? It's the biggest question on everyone's mind, except of course, who will win the World Cup. Want to be a good guest at the World Cup? Check out embarrassing tourist mistakes you make in different countries, or watch this video instead.